friends, welcome to this quick video on some terminology that you're going to see when it comes to experiments. But first, why do plants hate math? Is it because it gives them square roots? You're welcome. Let's see what we're talking about. Okay, so let me recommend that you take notes on this stuff because you're going to need to know things like which variable is which. So we're talking about experiments. And one of the most simple but most powerful methods scientists can use is called the controlled experiment. Controlled experiment. So I mentioned before that there's multiple ways that scientists gather evidence. And the really important thing is that scientists gather objective evidence that can be used to make an argument. But there is a place for the kinds of experiments you may have done in the past and the kinds of experiments you're more usually going to encounter in your school experience, and that's called the controlled experiment. And a controlled experiment, at its simplest, what we're trying to do is see if one thing affects another. So we ask a question, does this thing affect this thing? And we set up the conditions that allow us to ask that question as best as possible. And when we do so, we are looking to see how one variable affects another. The one that we're interested in first is called the independent variable. And that's the one that we're changing, or we're interested in using its change to see if there's a corresponding change in another one. And the other one is called the dependent variable. Dependent variable. So this can be a little bit confusing, especially with the terminology. The way I like to think of it is the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. So if we've done our experimental design correctly, we're going to change, or we're going to look at a change in the independent variable and then watch for how the other variable depends on it, right? The dependent variable. Let me give you an example that might make this a little clearer. This would be a very simple experiment. Let's say that we had asked the question, do seeds need water to germinate? We know that seeds do need water to germinate, but look, this just makes for a really simple example that we can use. So if we ask that question, we might set up an experiment where we have two groups. The first group is one that we water. So this is a pot full of seeds right here that we do water. And this is a pot full of seeds right here that we don't water. So our independent variable right here is water, whether or not we're watering the plants. And that's what we are changing. We set up the experiment, we change one variable, and that is whether or not we water it. And then we are looking for the response in our dependent variable. And our dependent variable is fraction of seeds that sprout. All right? The thing that we're looking, does seed sprouting depend on amount of water? So that's our independent and dependent variable. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is controlled variables. Controlled variables. So we have our independent and dependent variables, and those are the ones that we are experimenting with, and then there's all these other things that could affect what's happening that we want to keep the same. We want to control them. So to be as confident as possible that the change in the dependent variable was actually caused by the change in the independent variable, a good experiment controls as many other variables as possible. We control as many other variables as possible, and we can call those controlled variables. Pause as needed. Sorry about that. Pause as needed to make sure you've got the notes. Okay, here's an example of which variables we would be controlling in this same experiment that we talked about before. So we already said the independent variable is water, whether or not we're watering the pot of seeds, and the dependent variable is what fraction of the seeds that we planted actually sprouted. So what are we controlling? Well, if we're doing a pretty good job, we are going to be controlling things like how many beans were in the pot. So 10 and 10. We put 10 beans in each pot. The type of pot, right? You see that they're both, let's say, clay pots. The size of the pot, they are identically sized. The amount of soil, so you can see that as well. The soil is the same. The amount of light, and that would be, let's just say, we put them on the same windowsill. They should get the same amount of light. And we know light is important for plants. The temperature, so if we put them in the same room, hopefully the temperature should be the same. And then there are many others, and this is one of the reasons that scientists do set up experiments in laboratories, because laboratories allow us to control so much that is going on in the natural world that could be affecting things. I'm just going to take a moment to remind you that there is a really important place in science for also looking at data that is where stuff isn't really controlled, and that's the point of doing something like field research, where you go out and you gather data in the actual world where no one has really controlled too much, and you're getting to understand the complexity of the world. But in order to answer certain questions, we do often do specific kinds of experiments in the lab. Okay, and then graphing data. So when we have independent and dependent variables, we graph them in a certain way, and this is by custom. In other words, this is just what scientists have agreed to do so that we can all see things the same way really quickly. And there's not really any for sure reason why we have to do it this way. We just do it this way so that we can look quickly. So by custom, the independent variable, is graphed on the x-axis, right? So you can see the independent variable here, water or no water, is on the x-axis, and the dependent variable, which in the case of this little experiment was the number of seeds that germinated, is on the y-axis. So just to be clear, this is our x-axis, and this is our y-axis. So the horizontal is always going to have our independent, the vertical is always going to have our dependent, and that's a pretty easy way to tell what the independent and dependent is if you're looking at a graph. Okay, and now let's transition this into our claim, evidence, and reasoning framework, just to see how the experiment was one way to fill out this little framework. So remember, a claim, that's our statement that answers a question. Our evidence is the data that we use to support the claim, and our reasoning is why, how and why the evidence supports the claim. So looking at our little experiment, and once again, apologies, this is not the right question. The question was, is water needed for these seeds to germinate? The Johnny Puberty one was from a previous example. And the claim here is water is necessary for seeds to germinate. So what evidence do we have that is related to that? Well, after we did our experiment, we saw, as you should have seen in that graphic, 9 out of 10 germinated after being watered, 0 out of 10 germinated after not being watered. And so our reasoning would have been, well, if water is necessary for seeds to start germinating, seeds not given water should not germinate. And you can see that our evidence supports that claim, and that is why, right? Based on things that we should know, or things that we think we know about plants, that is going to support our claim. And as you've already heard, oftentimes what scientists are doing is they're starting off making a hypothesis, which is kind of a tentative claim, and then they're actually finding evidence that doesn't support that hypothesis, and that's the more exciting part of science. Okay, so I hope you learn independent, dependent, and controlled variables in this and where they go on the axes of a graph. See you next time.